welcome you all. Myself, Dr. Mrinmayee, working as an assistant professor in the Department of Anatomy in Pondicherry. So today we are going to discuss in the session about the intercostal spaces. So we are going to learn under the following heading, that is, we will see what about the intercostal spaces, the contents of the intercostal spaces, and description of the muscles. So the intercostal spaces, as the name suggests, that the intercostal spaces, that means in between the two costal. Okay, so in between the two ribs, what are the spaces present are called as the intercostal spaces. These are, you can see here, these are the intercostal spaces. Okay, so here you can see the thoracic cage. And in this thoracic cage, we know that the anteriorly around 5 centimeter in length, so they are articulating with the lateral articulating surfaces of the sternum. The bony part of the ribs are not directly articulated with the sternum. Only the costal cartilages, they are articulating with the sternum, whereas posteriorly, the posterior end of the ribs, they are articulating directly with the lateral surface of the vertebra. So the intercostal spaces are 11 in number. So these are 11 in number. Last two spaces, okay, so last two spaces are open in front. Now, why this last two spaces are open in front? Because the last two spaces are the floating ribs. So, as these are floating ribs, so definitely the spaces are incomplete in these two spaces. Okay, so the last two spaces, that is 11th and 12th ribs, so they are forming this incomplete intercostal spaces. Whereas in the other intercostal spaces, these are complete intercostal space. So this, we have seen that the intercostal spaces are the spaces present between the two ribs and anteriorly between the two costal cartilages. These are 11 in number. Last two intercostal spaces are open in front, as it is made up of 11 and 12 ribs which are floating. What about this typical intercostal space? Typical intercostal spaces are the spaces which supplied by the nerves confined to the spaces. Okay, so the nerves confined to the intercostal spaces, these are called as the typical intercostal space. Okay, so we will see one by one. So next, what about the boundary of these spaces? So as we know, if any space is present, it will have the boundary, right? So what about the boundary of the intercostal spaces? So in this image, you can see here, this is one intercostal space. Okay, so this is one intercostal space, that is typical intercostal space. Above, it is bounded by sharp lower margin of the upper rib. So as you can remember, we have mostly you have learned the ribs in the osteology classes. So we know that the rib has got the lower sharp margin and the upper border is blunt. So in this image, you can see here, this is the upper border which is blunt, and this is the lower border of the rib which is sharp. As a result, you can see here it is making the costal groove, right? So the one we are seeing here, that is the boundary of the intercostal spaces. So the boundary of intercostal spaces, above it is bounded by the sharp lower margin of the upper rib and its cartilages. So as I have told you that the front around 5 centimeter in length, it is composed of the costal cartilage as the bony component directly not articulating with the sternum. Now below the boundary is by the blunt, as I have mentioned now, it is bounded by the blunt upper margin of the lower rib and its cartilages. Now this intercartilaginous boundary is present only in front. Okay, so the intercartilaginous boundary will be present only in the front or the anterior part, whereas the interosseous part apart from this intercartilaginous part will be called as the interosseous part in front. Now what is the boundary in front? In front, lateral border of the sternum between the costal notches. So here you can see the sternum. This is the body of the sternum. This is the manubrium of the sternum, and this part is the xiphoid process. Okay. So in the lateral border of the sternum, we have seen this costal facet where the costal cartilages are articulating. So in front, it is bounded by the lateral border of the sternum between the costal notches. Behind, so you can see behind by the body of the corresponding thoracic vertebra. Behind by the body of the corresponding thoracic vertebra. So you must have learned in the thoracic vertebra how you differentiate between the cervical vertebra, thoracic vertebra, lumbar vertebra, and the sacrum. Sacrum, so it's a 5 sacral vertebra, they are forming the sacrum. But in the thoracic vertebra, cervical vertebra, and the lumbar vertebra, there are some characteristic features, right? So, as in the cervical vertebra, the foramen transversalia will be present. The thoracic vertebra, in the body of the thoracic vertebra, costal facet will be present, right? Costal facet will be present, and in the lumbar vertebra, costal facet will not be present. So, for what purpose this costal facet is present? Its facet is present to articulate with the posterior end of the ribs, whereas the anterior end of the ribs, they are articulating with the costal cartilage. So, what we have learned in now about the boundary of the one typical intercostal space, that is above it is bounded by the sharp lower margin of the upper rib and its cartilages, below by the blunt superior border of the lower rib and its cartilages, in front by the lateral border of the sternum between the costal notches, and behind body of the corresponding thoracic vertebra. Moving into the contents of the intercostal spaces. It contains muscles, these are known as the intercostal muscles, vessels, and nerves. Now here also in this image you can see this is skin, then the superficial fascia. After that we can see the deep fascia and the muscle. Right here what you are seeing, these are the contents of the intercostal space. Okay, so these are the content of the intercostal space. Okay, so intercostal space contents. So here you can see the nerves from exterior to interior. This is external intercostal muscle, internal intercostal muscle. Between the internal intercostal muscle or intercostalis internals, external intercostal muscle is also called as the intercostalis externals. So in between the internal intercostal muscle and the intercostalis intimus muscle, that is the innermost intercostal muscle, lies this neurovascular bundle. Neurovascular bundle means the intercostal nerves, intercostal veins, and the intercostal arteries. Now, how the arrangement is present? The arrangement from above to downward is intercostal veins, then intercostal arteries, and intercostal nerve. So, as here the costal is present, this intercostal vein, intercostal artery, and the intercostal nerve, these are occupying this costal groove. So the in the most lower part near the lower margin. So definitely the intercostal nerve will have the longest course. So the contents of the intercostal spaces are muscles, vessels, and nerves. Now about the intercostal muscles, from outside to inside, these are external intercostal muscle, internal intercostal muscle, and this is the innermost intercostal muscle. Now, about the intercostalis externals, origin is from the lower border of the upper limb. Insertion is outer limb of the upper border of the lower limb. So the upper border of the limb has got outer limb, intermediate area, and inner limb. Okay. So the origin is from the lower margin or border of the upper limb, and the insertion is over the upper border in the outer limb. Now, as I have mentioned to you that anteriorly there is the intercartilaginous part. Now, this intercartilaginous part is replaced by muscle fibers are not present. Okay, the intercostalis externus muscle fibers are not present anteriorly. In the intercartilaginous part, it is replaced by a membrane which is called as the anterior intercostal membrane. Whereas in the interosseous part, okay, apart from this intercartilaginous part, in the interosseous part, the fibers are fleshy. Okay, so the intercostalis externus muscle origin, it takes origin from the lower border of the upper limb. Insertion on the upper border of the lower limb in the outer limb. In the outer limb, interosseous part is fleshy in intercostalis externus muscle, and intercartilaginous part is replaced by the intercostal membrane, that is anterior intercostal membrane. So the direction of the fibers and the arrangement of the fibers we will see later again. Now about the intercostalis internals. Intercostalis internals origin is from the costal groove of the upper limb. Okay, so it is taking origin from the costal groove of the upper limb. Insertion is over the intermediate area. Can you see here? So intermediate area of the upper border of the lower limb. Okay, the insertion is on the intermediate area of the upper border of the lower limb. The intercartilaginous part here, it is fleshy, and the interosseous part of posterior, it is posteriorly. Okay, only posteriorly, not in the whole of the length or diameter of the interosseous part. Only posteriorly it is replaced by the posterior intercostal membrane. Okay, so the intercostalis internals origin is from the costal groove of the upper limb. Insertion is over the intermediate area or intermediate part of the upper border of the lower limb. Intercartilaginous part is exactly opposite to the intercostalis externus here, that is fleshy here, and in externus anterior part is replaced by the anterior intercostal membrane. The interosseous part of these are replaced by the posterior intercostal membrane only in the posterior most part. Okay, remember, only in the posterior most part, not in the whole of the diameter of the spaces. Now about the intercostalis intimus muscle. Intercostalis intimus muscle takes origin. So here you can see this is the intercostalis intimus muscle or innermost intercostal muscle. So the intercostalis intimus muscle, it takes origin from the upper limb of the costal groove of the above limb. Okay, so it takes origin from the upper limb of the costal groove of the above limb, and it inserts over the inner limb of the upper border of the below rib. Okay, so it inserts over the inner rib of the upper corner of the below rib. So intercostalis externus is attached to the outer lip. Intermediate area is its attachment to the intercostalis internus, and the intercostalis intimus muscle is attached to the inner lip of the upper corner of the below rib. Now, this intercostalis intimus muscle is only present in the whole of the length. You can see the whole of the length is present, right? So, whole of the length of this intercostal these spaces, the intercostalis intimus muscle is not present. It is only present in the intermediate 2/4 of the typical intercostal spaces. It is only present in the intermediate area or region of this 2/4 of the typical intercostal spaces. Now, remember, the neurovascular plane is present in between the intercostalis internus and the intercostalis intimus. The intercostalis intimus and the intercostalis internus in between the neurovascular plane is present. Now, how this arrangement of the neurovascular bundle is present? That is vein, artery, and the nerves. Okay, intercostal veins, intercostal arteries, intercostal nerves. Now about the intercostal arteries. So the intercostal arteries are present in all spaces except last two. Okay, so except the last two spaces, the anterior intercostal arteries are present in all the spaces. In each space, the anterior intercostal artery, you can see the anterior intercostal arteries, right? So these are two in number in each space. Okay, so these are two in number in each space. One follow the lower margin of the rib, and other follows the upper margin of the lower rib. Okay, so one follows the lower margin of the upper rib, another follows the upper margin of the lower rib. So each intercostal spaces contains two intercostal arteries. That is two anterior intercostal arteries. Okay, upon 6 spaces, the anterior intercostal arteries are the branches from the internal thoracic artery. So here you can see this is the internal thoracic artery, which is coming from the subclavian artery. Okay, which is coming from the subclavian artery. It gives off two anterior intercostal arteries in each spaces till 6 intercostal space. After that, in the lower 3 spaces, these anterior intercostal arteries are branches from the musculophrenic artery. So this musculophrenic artery is nothing but the terminal branch of the internal thoracic artery. Another terminal branch of the internal thoracic artery is superior epigastric artery. So the upper 6 spaces, the internal thoracic artery, it gives a direct branch that the two anterior intercostal arteries to each spaces, and in lower 3 spaces, it gives branches to the musculophrenic artery. Okay, so the anterior intercostal spaces, it contains the anterior intercostal arteries. These are 2 in number in each spaces. Now, what about the posterior intercostal artery? In this image, you can see the posterior intercostal arteries. The posterior intercostal arteries, these are 1 in number in each space. And anterior intercostal arteries are 2 in number in each space, whereas the posterior intercostal arteries, these are 1 in number in each space. Upper 2 spaces, these are branches from the superior intercostal artery. And the lower 9 spaces, these are the branches coming from the descending thoracic aorta. So here you can see the descending thoracic aorta. Okay, so the superior intercostal artery, it gives off in the 2 spaces, the posterior intercostal artery. The superior intercostal artery is the branch from the intercostocervical trunk. The lower 9 spaces, these are the branches from the descending thoracic aorta. Now the descending thoracic aorta, as it is present in the left side of our body, intercostal artery, as the posterior intercostal arteries is will be shorter than the right posterior intercostal arteries, because the descending thoracic aorta is present in the left side. Now, what about the veins? Veins, the anterior intercostal veins in upper 6 spaces that drain into the internal thoracic vein. Okay, in the upper 6 spaces, the anterior intercostal veins, these are draining into the internal thoracic vein. The last 3 spaces, these are draining into the musculophrenic vein. Okay, so the anterior intercostal veins, upper 6 spaces, drains into the internal thoracic vein, and the last 3 spaces drains into the musculophrenic vein. About the posterior intercostal vein. Posterior intercostal vein. Here you can see the posterior intercostal vein, right? So this posterior intercostal veins in the right side. In the right side, first posterior intercostal vein, it drains into the right brachiocephalic vein. Okay, it drains into the right brachiocephalic vein, and the second, third, and occasionally fourth posterior intercostal vein unite to form the right superior intercostal vein. Ultimately, it drains into the arch of azygos vein. Okay, you can see the azygos venous system here. So the second, third, and occasionally fourth unite to form the right superior intercostal vein. Ultimately, it drains into the arch of azygos vein. 5th to 11th posterior intercostal vein drain into the azygos vein. Whereas in the left side, here you can see in the left side, the first posterior intercostal vein, it drains into the left brachiocephalic vein. So in the right side also, the first one drains into the brachiocephalic vein, and the left side also it drains into the brachiocephalic vein. Now second, third, and fourth form the left superior intercostal vein, just like in the right side. Okay, so the second, third, and fourth form the left superior intercostal vein. 5th to 6th drain into the hemiazygos vein. So 5th to 6th drain into the hemiazygos vein, and 8th to 11th drain into the inferior hemiazygos vein. Okay, the 8th to 11th drains into the inferior hemiazygos vein. Now about the intercostal nerve. Intercostal nerve, these are also 11 in number. Now 3rd to 4th, 6th are the typical intercostal nerves. Why? Because these are confined to the corresponding intercostal spaces. So these are 3rd to 6th intercostal spaces are the typical intercostal space, because this nerve supplying the intercostal spaces are confined to their corresponding intercostal spaces. So because of that only, the 3rd to 6th intercostal spaces are called as a typical intercostal space, as they are supplied by the confined intercostal nerves. First one is the thoracic nerve. Okay, so first one is the thoracic nerve, because what happens, the first one, it will join with the lower trunk of the brachial plexus. It will join with the lower trunk of the brachial plexus. Second intercostal nerve forms the intercostobrachial nerve. Second intercostal nerve forms the intercostobrachial nerve, which supplies the medial side of our arm and the armpit. Okay, so the second intercostal nerve is it is larger in size, and it forms the intercostobrachial nerve, and it supplies the medial side of the arm and the armpit. 7th to 11th appear in the anterior abdominal wall. 7th to 11th appear in the anterior abdominal wall. So the intercostal nerves are 11 in number. 3rd to 6th intercostal nerve are typical intercostal nerve. 3rd to 6th intercostal spaces are the typical intercostal spaces. First intercostal nerve, it joins with the lower trunk of the brachial plexus, and the second one forms the intercostobrachial nerve. 7 to 11 appear in the anterior abdominal wall. So here in this video, I will show you the dissected part. Along with that, the origin and insertion of the muscle. Okay. So we can see the anterior thoracic wall. So we know that the anterior thoracic wall from outside to inside is covered by the skin. So if I see the part of the skin here, already we have removed in the upper division. This is fascia. So we know that the deep fascia of the anterior thoracic wall is thinner than the posterior part. We know that intercostal spaces on either side. So this intercostal spaces 3 to 6, that is 6 intercostal spaces are the biggest intercostal space. Why is because that is the there are confined to the third, fourth, intercostal spaces. This intercostal spaces, if we see the boundaries here, so you can see this is one intercostal space. So what I am showing you is one intercostal space. So let us see the boundary of the intercostal space. This is one intercostal space. Superiorly, it is bounded by this lower sharp margin of the upper tree. So here you can see the lower sharp margin of the upper tree. Okay. Now we know it is bounded by the margin of the lower. So this is the one intercostal space. Medially or anteriorly, it is bounded by the lateral margin of the sternum. Posteriorly, I'm going to show here, it is bounded by the side of the body of the thoracic vertebra. Okay, so this is about the boundary of one intercostal space. These intercostal spaces, as it faces forward, that is towards the anterior chest wall, it becomes broadened. If we posteriorly, it becomes narrower. Okay, so the intercostal spaces are broader. Forward. Discuss about the context of the intercostal space. Focusing over the whole intercostal space. Now this intercostal space contains the muscles, and this is one by one. Then we will see the intercostal nerves, intercostal vessels. That includes the arteries. Now muscles first. So the muscles, they are arranged in 3 phases from outside to inside. So the outermost muscle is the intercostalis externus. So here you can see the intercostalis externus. So this muscle is intercostalis externus. So this intercostalis externus, it is present the most superficial aspect. Extension of the intercostalis externus muscle, it extends from the costochondral junction to the posteriorly to the angle of the tree. Okay. Now this part about the most anterior part. Here what happens? We know that the most anterior part, it doesn't act in the side of the skull. So this Posteriorly is interosseous part. So anteriorly most anterior part of the intercartilaginous part, posteriorly interosseous part. What happens to the is external intercostalis muscle or the intercostalis externus. This intercostalis externus, as I have told you, extends from the costochondral junction to the posteriorly to the angle of the rib. So here you can see, I am showing you this is not the external intercostalis muscle. You can see here in this left part, this is a key area. What happens here? The intercartilaginous part is actually the part of the external intercostalis muscle is actually membranous. So it is replaced by the anterior intercostal membrane. Okay. Direction of the fibers. As you can see, most anteriorly, the direction of the fibers are directed downward, forward, and medial. Okay. Forward and medial. So, inside the origin of this external intercostalis muscle is from the lower border or lower margin of the upper rib. So as I have shown you, this is the lower margin of the upper rib and insert over the part of the this blunt upper area of the lower rib. Okay, so origin is from the lower margin of the upper rib. Insertion is to the outermost part of the upper part of this lower rib. Okay, about the internal intercostal muscle. That is intercostal internus muscle. This intercostal internus muscle, it takes origin from the inner surface or the floor of the costal roof. So you have already attended the osteology class of the ribs. So it takes origin from the floor of the costal roof and inserts on the this costal roof. This is the upper rib, okay, and it inserts on the inner surface or intermediate area of the lower rib. That is upper margin of the lower rib. Okay. What is the direction of this intercostalis internus muscle? The direction is exactly as you can see here. This was the direction of the intercostalis externus muscle. The intercostalis internus muscle direction is exactly opposite to the direction of the externus muscle. That is right angle to the direction. Downward, forward, and lateral. Okay, so the direction of these two muscles are exactly opposite to each other. Now, about the membrane, I have told you here for the externus, that is anterior intercostal membrane. For the intercartilaginous part, here it is anterior intercostal membrane. For this intercostalis internus, what happens? The posterior part, starting from the angle of the rib, is replaced by this posterior intercostal membrane. Okay. So for the intercostalis internus muscle, anterior part is actually the fleshy part. So this is exactly the arrangement is different or opposite to the externus and internus. Now about the innermost muscle, that is intercostalis intimus. Now this intercostalis intimus is actually, this is the part of the muscle where you can see this is the, in this one space, what we have done, we have reflected the externus muscle, then we have reflected the internus muscle, then after that this is the innermost muscle. Is it visible? This is the most innermost muscle. This is the intercostal intimus. Okay. So this intercostal intimus origin is from the inner surface of the upper rib. Okay. And intercostalis intimus is exactly the direction of the fiber. Important here that intercostalis internus that's the most important arrangement of the structures. These are the intercostal vein or the intercostal veins, intercostal arteries, and the intercostal nerves. Here you can see the intercostal nerve. But to see all of the contents, we have to actually look at the whole of the thoracic one. So this, as the intercostal nerve is present exactly in the lowermost part of the costal margin, so part of this nerve we can show you. Arteries and the veins will be difficult to show now. So as we have discussed about the intercostalis externus, intercostalis internus, and the intercostalis intimus. Now this intercostalis intimus we have discussed part of this transversus thoracic muscle. Other muscles are subcostal. Now sternocostals. The transverse, intercostalis intimus, it is actually present in the of the intercostal spaces. Okay, it's not present in all of the length of the intercostal spaces. Middle of these intercostal spaces, that is around the maxillary line. Posteriorly, what happens in the lower spaces, there is another muscle that is known as the subcostalis, which I cannot show now. I can show you the sternocostalis. So here you can see the inner or the internal part of this thoracic wall. This is already the dissected part. So here you can see this muscle. I hope it is visible nicely. So this is actually the sternocostalis muscle. The sternocostalis muscle is present in the anterior part. It takes origin from the lower part of the posterior surface of this body of the sternum. So what is this? This is actually the sternum. So this is the body of the sternum, posterior surface. So muscle fiber, it takes origin from the lower part of this posterior surface of the body of the sternum. Also, some part from this posterior surface of the xiphoid process. So here you can see this is actually the xiphoid process. Now, what is the direction of this muscle fiber? The direction of this muscle fiber is actually upward. As you can see, the direction is upward and lateral. Okay, upward, forward, and lateral. This is so. Rest of the other muscles, what I have told you, that they are directed downward, forward, medially in case of sternus muscle, laterally in case of internus muscle, and also the intimus muscle. And here the direction is upward, forward, and lateral. So this muscle is the sternocostalis muscle. It serves over the, you can see here, this will be the costal cartilages. So inner surfaces of the lower costal cartilages. Okay. So this is about another part of the transversus thoracic muscle. So there are three muscles included in this transversus thoracic muscle. Subcostalis, which we have not seen today. Intercostalis intimus, as we have already mentioned, and this is sternocostalis. So as the name suggests, sternum and the costal cartilage. Okay. of two anterior intercostal arteries to each of the except in the 11th and 12th, because 11th and 12th are the floating rings. So I want to the 11th to 10th to 12th rings, they are floating rings. The spaces like this arrangement we will not see. Okay. So this is actually the internal thoracic artery, which consists of two anterior intercostal arteries in each space. One artery runs along the lower margin or border of the upper limb. Another artery runs along the upper margin of the lower limb. Okay, I'm talking about one intercostal space. The lower three spaces, this intercostal arteries, they are derived from the musculophrenic artery, whereas in the upper spaces, it is derived from the internal thoracic artery. Musculophrenic artery is actually the terminal branch of the internal thoracic artery. Okay, now about here we cannot show, I'm just mentioning that the posterior intercostal artery. The posterior intercostal artery are one in number in each space. Intercostal arteries are two in number. Okay, and the intercostal arteries are one in number. They are derived in the upper two spaces from the superior intercostal artery, and in the other spaces they are derived from the descending thoracic artery. Now this anterior intercostal artery, upper one, and this posterior intercostal artery, the anastomosis at the anterior 1/3 and posterior 2/3 of the intercostal space. Now already I have shown you. Now as it is present, if the arrangement is vein, artery, and nerve, the nerve will have the longest course. Okay, so the nerves confined to the 3rd to 6th intercostal spaces are the typical intercostal nerve. As the first intercostal nerve, it takes part in the formation of the brachial fractures. Second intercostal nerve, it continues as the intercostobrachial nerve, which actually supplies the axilla and the inner part of the arm. After that, 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th, they actually go to supply the anterior abdominal wall. So that is why only the 3rd to 6th intercostal nerves are called as the typical intercostal nerve. About the veins, along with this arteries also runs the veins. Okay, veins are the anterior intercostal vein, which drains into the internal thoracic vein. So you can see the veins actually here, and the musculophrenic vein. The anterior intercostal veins, they drains into the internal thoracic vein. The lower spaces, intercostal veins, they drain into the posterior intercostal, into the musculophrenic vein. Whereas for the posterior intercostal vein in the left and right side, first one and this first one, it drains into the brachiocephalic vein. That is, ultimately drains into the brachiocephalic. First, it drains into the superior intercostal vein. Then for the second, third, and fourth, they actually drains into the azygos vein. For the right side, the rest of the veins, these are the rest of the posterior intercostal vein that are the starting from the 5th level, they drain into the rest of the this azygos vein, the vertical part of the azygos vein. Whereas in the left side, as I have told you before, drain into the azygos vein. Hopefully you have understood the origin, insertion, and the direction of the muscle fibers, and the contents also I have tried to show you. So after this understanding of the contents of the intercostal spaces, we know there is a condition called as the intercostal neuralgia. Now, what happens this intercostal neuralgia? So at this image, you can see this red color. What they're showing, this is the intercostal space. Now, what happens due to the any injury happens due to any rib fracture or maybe any viral infection of the spinal ganglia of this thoracic nerve, it will lead into this neuralgia. It is a very sharp, cruciating pain. Okay, so it may be seen in the rib fracture or maybe it is seen in the viral infection, that is the herpes infection. So at the end of the session, we have learned about the intercostal spaces, what is about the typical intercostal space, boundaries of the intercostal space, that is mainly the typical intercostal space, and the except the 11th and 12th, these are not the typical boundary we will see in case of other intercostal spaces. We have seen the contents of the intercostal spaces, which are the forming the neurovascular bundle in the costal groove. The arrangement of this neurovascular bundle is like we can remember by the mnemonic as hand, that E for vein, that is the intercostal veins, then intercostal arteries, then intercostal nerves. So as the intercostal nerves are present in the lowermost part, so definitely it will have the longest course amongst all these contents of these neurovascular contents of this costal groove. And this costal groove, it is this content of, that is the neurovascular bundle. These are present in between the intercostalis internus and intercostalis intimus muscle. This is very important to understand. In the intercostalis externus, anteriorly, that is cartilaginous part, it is replaced by the membrane, that is the anterior intercostal membrane. And the intercostalis internus muscle, it get replaced by this posterior intercostal membrane, or in the interosseous part, only the posterior most part, not in the whole of the length of the interosseous part. So hopefully you have understood the topic. So after this video, alongside the you can read from the textbook, then you will have the better understanding of the subject. With this, I would like to end the session.